we start off with a desire to prove credibility. Now, why do you think the genre would require that? Sam?
Because it's talking about a race that is considered less than.
Yes.
He automatically has to prove himself to the white people.
Yes, unfortunately, with slave narratives like this, part of the reason that they sold so well was just out of curiosity, a kind of morbid curiosity. So it wasn't just abolitionists that were buying these books. It couldn't have been because they sold so well. So partly it was because, like, oh, I want to see if this group of people, this person is capable of presenting themselves in a way that would be credible. And right from the very beginning, he has to work hard to get people on his side who would be otherwise extremely racist. Yeah.
I think we were talking about with them stuff. He's a younger kid and he's really good at saying about it.
Yeah.
Most people wouldn't trust a 12-year-old saying and stuff. But when he immediately goes out and says, "This is what I remember from when I was 12 years old, and this is what happened when I was 12," it kind of makes it so we trust him from 12 and up because it's like this 12-year-old understands a lot. So I'm going to trust what he says even when he was 20 and 30 because he knew what he was talking about. 12.
That's a really good point. The fact that he recognizes this danger, for example, of asking the slave master and that the slave master would see him as having a restless spirit. He kind of transfers probably what he understood later in life, but he kind of says, like, I understood this even as a child. To give him this sense of, I mean, I think Frederick Douglass was a legitimate genius. But to give this sense that, like, his memory is incredible, for one thing, and also that he understood the realities of his situation better than most of the people reading the book, even as a baby, even as a little kid. Yeah, Christiane.
I feel like he uses language that it sounds scholarly, but for the most part, a child could still understand it as well.
Yeah, and why do you think that would help him gain credibility? Especially the child, like the simplicity part.
It's more of, like, I remember reading a quote, I don't even remember who said it, but, like, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it.
Yeah, I think that his vocabulary is enormous. You see this throughout the book, right? But it's always very accessible, and in fact, I know that this book gets assigned quite a lot in junior high, too. And I like that you're saying this idea of, like, that simplicity is a sign that he has a full grasp of his own argument. I think that's so true. Yeah. Sam?
Going off what Christiane said, I mean, if you've ever tried to read, like, ancient philosopher texts, or even just as so far as Shakespeare, it's so confusing. Just the way that they word things.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he does it right. He makes it easier to read.
So then tell me about his priorities, because Shakespeare and Frederick Douglass have very different priorities then. And I think their language choice, I'm not going to say that Shakespeare doesn't have that kind of credibility, you know? So why is the language choice appropriate then for his subject?
Probably because it's something that needs to be understood by Shakespeare.
Okay, good. He needs a much wider audience. Shakespeare at the time would have been understood, as far as I can tell, by the people watching his plays. But let's think about the philosophers, for example. The philosophers, there's a goal sometimes to have as niche and as specific a philosophy as you can, right? So that only the smart will be able to understand you, and then you can all be kind of in on the know, right? Not all philosophers are that way, but some are. Frederick Douglass has an equally complicated topic here, but it's in his best interest to distill it to the most important, most emotionally effective parts of his story. Because what he's trying to do, he has a political goal here. He doesn't want you just to sympathize with him. He wants you to abolish slavery, you know? So in order to get that goal, you have to get, like, a ton of people, and you need the masses to be able to understand it and to be able to feel that sympathy. Anything else that he's doing in the beginning here to gain that ethos, that credibility? I think we nailed it, though, when we said, like, he's got to start with credibility, and it's why you have the preface in the letter here, too. As unfortunate as that reality is, they need it. All right, go to chapter 2. Jonas. And this is a couple pages in. I should have looked because you guys mostly have the same one, but this is the paragraph that starts Mr. Severe. This is a very disturbing moment. What's your warning?
What's I think it's page 10, the second paragraph.
Oh, thank you. The one that starts, Mr. Severe was rightly named.
Oh, it's 9.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, there's
Okay.
one sentence.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, he's a character, so that makes sense. All right. Yeah, Mr. Severe was rightly named. Okay. All right, as I am reading this, I want you to annotate. I'm going to give you a couple minutes afterwards. I want you to annotate for how you think he is building his argument here. So pathos, logos, ethos, whatever you think it is, and annotate which word choice you think is going to be most important. All right. Mr. Severe was rightly named. He was a cruel man. I have seen him whip a woman, causing the blood to run half an hour at the time. And this too in the midst of her crying children, pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take great pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity. Okay, take a minute. I want you to annotate that for diction choices that he makes. It's just the very first part of the paragraph that starts, Mr. Severe was rightly named. All right, ignore me for a second. I forgot to press record, so I have to explain that to the people at home. You just keep annotating. Oh, wait, no, I did press record. Hello, people at home. Okay, you're thinking about diction in the first part of that paragraph. Okay, I also want you to think about the order of ideas in that first paragraph, in the first part of that paragraph, the part that I just read. Think about why he chooses the order of the ideas here. Okay, now again, this is one instance that Frederick Douglass experienced. He could have chosen many other instances, and in fact, he hints at many other instances that he could have talked about, but he talks about this one specifically. So talk in your groups for a second here about your observations about the diction choices and the word order choices, which is also called syntax, by the way. Diction and syntax choices.
So, you know,
Okay, let's talk together here. I especially want to talk about the order of ideas because we've done a lot talking about the word choice. We haven't done as much talking about the structure of the sentences themselves, right? So you start with Mr. Severe's name, which seems, he says, seems appropriate to who he is. This idea of cruel man, but here's where I want to focus. He whips the woman. Frederick Douglass describes the blood. He describes the amount of time that the blood flows, and then he gets to this idea of the crying children, and then he gets the idea of pleading for their mother's release. So he chooses the order of this sentence. He could have given us different details from this instance first, right? He could have talked about the children first, but instead he talks about the whipping first and then proceeds on to the children. So I think it's clear, to me at least, that someone's children being present makes the scene more emotional. Let's talk, though, about the order that he presents the ideas. So why do you think he uses this order? Emmeline?
Because he starts the paragraph saying that he's a full man.
Yeah.
So I think he uses the order to like justify that claim. So it's not like Mr. Severe. He's cruel because this is what he did and this is the result.
Okay, so it then creates a kind of definitional claim a little bit, right? To go back to our logical claims. I think it's clear to see this part as building the pathos in the scene, but it's also building the logos of it. So he says, this is what cruelty is, and let me explain the parts of cruelty, and this justifies then my definition of cruelty. Sam?
Each time that he adds a new sentence,
Yeah.
it's going off of the previous sentence.
Yeah.
So he goes off of how he was cruel, and then how that cruelty makes him hurt women, and how those women are mothers, and how those mothers have their children, and the children's even getting taken away. It's just like a domino effect.
Okay, so then it's more like a causal claim. One thing is leading to the other. And would you say that the severity gets worse as it goes? Or, okay, so that a child pleading for their mother is a more severe consequence to think about than the actual blood of the wound. Okay. Yeah, Christian.
Going off of that, he basically makes you feel bad and then makes you feel worse.
Yeah, right. And now why does he want to do that?
To create that sympathy.
To build on that sympathy then. So you're not going to get the sympathy just from the pleading. You're going to get the sympathy, though, from the cause of the domino effect, as you say.
Yeah, and even during this time, I think like the average white person, maybe even have one or two slaves, if they like read this, or even I bet if Mr. Severe read this, if he really like saw that word for word about what he's actually doing, I think it could really change that. A lot of people during this time were very narrow-minded. I didn't even bother to look at the full spectrum of what they were actually doing. And the people that didn't know what they were doing, they're just going to do the same.
Yeah, and Mr. Severe could be one of those people. At least Frederick Douglass seems to think that Mr. Severe was one of those people that knew what he was doing, right? However, I get your point here. There's a way that expectations are undercut here. This idea of the kids pleading for their mom starts to undercut some expectations that Frederick Douglass himself set in the very first paragraph. Do you remember when he talks about horses? Right? He's comparing people to possessions, to animals. And here he says, but the children are pleading for their mother's release. Yeah, Sam?
Sorry, just one more thing. Just to compare this right here to another like slave or like black Time to Kill. At the very end scene, the lawyer is describing what happened to the little girl, and then at the very last minute, that's when he said, "Now imagine black." So like, I think this is doing a similar thing to what that's doing. Yeah. Like if you look at it in the cause, because nowhere in here it actually says that Mr. Severe is doing this to an African American woman. So it just, for all you know, you could be reading it and you could be and doing this to a white person.
Yes, I think that Frederick Douglass is being very careful about when he uses the word slave and when he uses the word woman and man, right? And I think this is one of those instances where he says woman on purpose to point out her humanity in this scene and to point out the children's humanity. A lot of times, this is gonna, I'm hesitant to say this example. I'm not saying that this is analogous, but this is a similar tactic that animal rights people will use to get you to care about inhumane practices, right? They will point out the emotional response that an animal's family, thank you. Who is this? Oh, Nathan's not here, Ella. Sorry. Thank you. They will use this tactic to say like, hey, you maybe don't expect this. And I think this is an appropriate comparison to make for this time period, even though it sounds gross in my mouth right now. But it's an appropriate comparison because if people were seeing their slaves as possessions, as chattel, then they were seeing them as animalistic, right? And so you have to point out that they have family connections and that they have rhetorical abilities, like they're pleading. That's a kind of rhetoric, right? They have a kind of intelligence to understand what's going on. Like these are ideas that it wouldn't have been shocking to people, but they needed that kind of reminder constantly. And this passage serves as that. Okay, we're gonna keep reading to see the second character that's introduced here. It says, added to his cruelty, he was a profane swearer. It was enough to chill the blood and stiffen the hair of an ordinary man to hear him talk. Here we get back to that impolite kind of attitude, the impropriety, right? Scarce a sentence escaped him, but that was commenced or concluded by some horrid oath. The field was a place to witness his cruelty and profanity. His presence made it both the field of blood and of blasphemy. From the rising till the going down of the sun, he was cursing, raving, cutting and slashing among the slaves of the field in the most frightful manner. His career was short. He died very soon after I went to Colonel Lloyd's, and he died as he lived, uttering with his dying groans bitter curses and horrid oaths. I think there's a bit of like bitter satisfaction there at the end of that paragraph. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of a merciful providence. Mr. Severe's place was filled by a Mr. Hopkins. He was a very different man. He was less cruel, less profane, and made less noise than Mr. Severe. His course was characterized by no extraordinary demonstrations of cruelty. He whipped, but seemed to take no pleasure in it. He was called by the slaves a good overseer. Okay, I want you with your groups to think about that second paragraph there, the one that starts Mr. Severe's place, and I want you to figure out the tone there. The tone is the author's attitude towards their subject. So I want you to figure out what is Mr. Frederick Douglass's attitude towards Mr. Hopkins. Okay, discuss.
I don't know.
I'm going to ask this question now that you've had a chance to talk about it a little bit. Does Frederick Douglass agree that Mr. Hopkins was a good overseer? Okay, what would you say the tone is in that little paragraph? How would you describe his attitude towards his subject here? Do you have, Cooper? Yeah?
So the tone seems, it's like kind of a bit of a relief.
Okay, good.
It's like, he's still like, oh, he's still whipping. It's all that. It's like, but it's not a guy who's taking personal pleasure in it, with genuine hatred for slaves. It's somebody who's doing it more as a job.
Okay, so that's interesting that you said, like, the way that you characterize that, right? You were like, oh, and he's still whipping. It seemed like a kind of resigned relief then, like this kind of cynical relief, where it's like, I know that the condition is going to be bad. This is what we get. This is the best it gets for us, is someone who whips us, but without the cruelty. Yeah, Eli.
I feel like kind of going along with that. I feel like it was kind of reluctantly content because they were just like in a really, really terrible position with Mr. Spear, and then all of a sudden it got way better. But that's only relative. Like they're still in a terrible condition, but it was a heck of a lot better than Mr. Spear.
Yeah, and I think that describes how he is describing the slaves' attitude towards him, right? That they're reluctantly content. He's saying he was called by the slaves a good overseer. That phrase, he was called by the slaves, that signals that Frederick Douglass is not fully accepting that attitude towards the overseer, right? It's saying that there's like, this was what he was called. I'm not fully going to say that that's what he was. Christiane?
It doesn't say that he wasn't cruel. It says he was less cruel, which compared to Mr. Severe, I feel like that's not a very high bar.
Yes, exactly. That's what I wrote to the side. I wrote low bar, low standards here, right? That the conditions could be this this bad that even somebody who whips but like with less swearing involved could be seen as an improvement. Yeah. Okay. So this chapter is kind of structured like this. You have the first half of the chapter is about whipping, and the second half of the chapter is about singing. And these are two forms of rhetoric that people are participating in the story. The first form of rhetoric is how you make your argument known through physical violence. And the second form is through singing. And I can prove this. He says here, this is right after the little snippet of song. He says, I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of these songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. So here he's rejecting the idea that a slave would have to present themselves as scholarly, all these words that we used to describe him in the beginning, like as scholarly, as fully fluent in English and in writing. He rejects that completely, and he says, honestly, if you would just listen to slave songs, you would get a better sense of the argument than you would by listening to all these abolitionists' arguments, right? He says that here. And then he goes on to describe how he, though, will not participate in this kind of singing. He says, slaves sing the most when they are unhappy. This is the very last paragraph before the chapter break. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them, only as an aching heart is relieved by his tears. At least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon to me while in the jaws of slavery. The singing of a man cast away upon a desolate island might be as appropriately considered as evidence of contentment and happiness as the singing of a slave. The songs of the one and the other are prompted by the same emotion. So what is his argument right there in the chapter? At the end of the chapter? Just in your own words, what's his argument about singing? And then to Anya.
He's talking a lot about how it's not joyous at all. It's their way of coping through this horrible time. It's their one link back to like Africa. So it's like their culture. It's what's left of what culture they used to have. It's what's kind of being carried over. And when he's talking about the sailor on his deserted island, it's their way of coping. They really have nothing left, and that's their one thing.
Okay, good. So it's like if you don't have age, you don't have parentage, you don't have free will anymore, all of those things you don't have anymore. The one thing that you have left that you can actually participate and be creative about is song. So it's not necessarily this like example of joyous celebration, it's definitely not. Anya, what were you gonna say the argument?
Sort of the same thing, but like
Yes.
Saying like that's wrong because he's saying how like sorrowful the songs were, and that it was it's just like the last thing they had left because they couldn't actually do themselves.
Yeah, so it's this sense of being like completely stuck. And I like on this pointing out something really important here. He's not just putting this in randomly to talk about song. This is a persistent stereotype that you can still see in movies these days. You kind of see a kind of like joyful celebration of being a slave on the plantation. Like have you seen like Gone with the Wind or Song of the South, that Disney movie? If you've ever gone on Splash Mountain, that's stereotype is represented there. So like he's directly contradicting expectations that people have. Yeah, good.
I think part of the song is like a sense of community and stuff, and that singing songs and stuff, it doesn't matter if you're educated, it doesn't matter if you know how to read at night, because people just teach you it, and every time it's the same, and just a sense of coming together and working together stronger.
Yeah, I could see that when he uses phrases like among slaves, or I'm trying to find a sense of the community in the actual language here.
Even if it wasn't community, like
they would sing as a chorus to words which many would seem unmeaning jargon, but were filled with meaning themselves. Yeah, I think it creates that sense of community that, yeah, Christiane.
We all have that one thing we do or that one place we go to escape from the world, and that's what singing is for them.
Yeah, and it might sound like it's like this joyous escape, but then you look at the words that they are actually saying and how he says if you actually listen to them, you would get the argument. I think that's like really important here. And this is like kind of esoteric, meaning like it's kind of like beside the point. But one argument people have made about slave narratives is that they seem to privilege a white elite form of communication. That a lot of them included stories of how the slave learned to read and write, and that allowed them to escape slavery. So that if only the slave would learn English and be able to use it in the way that the community would like him to use it, then he'll be able to escape. People have found that really problematic, and that's why I love this little section, is that Frederick Douglass has said, no, like the culture that they built up among slaves, even when that culture was prohibited in so many ways, that was really powerful as an argument. It's just that no one will listen to it. And he seems extremely bitter right here about that stereotype. Okay, here's my last question about this chapter then. Why does he frame the chapter this way? So he has, within one chapter, a section on whipping and a section on singing. Why does he group them together into one chapter instead of separating them? What do you think he's suggesting about the connection between the two, potentially? Yeah, Emmeline?
There's both, and like, they both can be in like very tragic and emotional moments.
Okay, good.
Because like when he's talking about the singing, he doesn't really talk about it as a joyous thing.
Yeah.
Like even if it's like a happy song, it's still rooted in deep melancholy and sadness.
Right.
So like I think that's what they're saying.
Okay, so both of them are highly emotional instances when the slave then is in pain. Yes, I think that's true. Why start with whipping and then finish with singing? Yeah, Christiane.
This is our misery, and this is how we escape from it.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's like a kind of cause and effect then, right? This is our misery. This is what causes our misery. This is how we respond to those miseries and find a kind of escape from it. There's two forms of rhetoric here. One is rhetoric, like means of persuasion, right? One is rhetoric through whipping and violence, and one is rhetoric through creative expression at the end. And so he's saying, like, this is how we had to respond to the one form of rhetoric, is with a form of rhetoric of our own. Okay, we just did a really long, thanks for sticking with me, close reading of a single chapter. So what I want you to do now, the next chapter, right, is go to chapter 4. Skip chapter 3, we're going to chapter 4. It's quite short. I'm gonna give you a minute here to scan through that chapter just to try and remember what the story